And there you go. It's much nicer than a Darth Vader voice, as we were discussing a moment ago. So we are live. This is the Transportation Standing Committee special meeting for April 15th, 2021. I'm your chair, Councillor Wei Mason from District 7. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Looking down the list, I think what we'll start with is asking our members to introduce themselves for a camera and audio check, and we'll go in the order of districts. So we'll start with Councillor Kent. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am here. And can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Going to Councillor Mancini, District 6.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to everybody.
Thank you. Councillor Stoddard, District 12.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Stoddard, District 12, Timberley Lakeside, Beachville, Clayton Park West, and Wedgwood. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Councillor Russell, District 15.
Good afternoon, everyone from sunny Lower Sackville, where it's mostly safe, and we're hoping to make it just a little bit safer.
Very good. Thank you. It's never too early to start. And we'll go to Deputy Mayor Outfit from District 16, coming to us from inside a fishbowl, apparently.
Yes, I'm under the microscope as usual, but I am here ready to go, Mr. Chair. Having a little camera issue, but I apologize.
Thank you very much, Councillor Outfit. So that's we are in now. Meeting has commenced. We've introduced everybody. We'll move to item 2, approval of minutes. I call for approval of minutes of March 25th, 2021.
I so moved.
Moved by Councillor Stoddard, seconded by Councillor Russell. Is there any further discussion on the minutes as presented? Seeing none, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Contrary-minded, nay. The motion has carried. 3, approval of the order of business and approval of additions and deletions. Madam Clerk, are there any additions or deletions on your end?
Mr. Chair, there's no additions or deletions from the clerk's office.
Thank you very much. And members, are there any requested additions? I don't believe there are. Seeing none. So we will move the agenda as presented. If someone would care to move the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Russell, seconded by Councillor Kent. Any further discussion on the agenda? Question's been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carries unanimously. We have an agenda. There is no business arising out of minutes. Item 5, call for declaration of conflict of interest. Are there any conflicts of interest? None. We'll move to 6. There are no items of reconsideration. There are no items of rescission, which brings us to item 8, consideration of deferred business. You know what? Did I miss the presentation? No, the presentation's next meeting, right? Sorry. So yeah, that brings us to deferred business, which is 8.1, presentation of regarding potential amendments to traffic calming administrative order. Who would like to take us? Brad, do you want to introduce your staff?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
If I could. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. We are really glad to have this opportunity to present to you our ideas about improving our traffic calming administrative order. This is a feedback presentation. The reason for this is we want to basically lean on the advice of the Transportation Standing Committee to help make sure that before we tear off and try to make some proposed changes and go through all the the due diligence of writing a report, that in fact we're generally in line with the way the committee sees it. And so we really value this feedback presentation today. This will give us a jump start to make sure we're not wasting time. Just as a quick introduction to Jody's presentation, whom I'll introduce in a second. We recognize traffic calming has quickly become council's arguable #1 priority. Staff has heard that loud and clear. When this policy was first developed, we were doing traffic calming on streets at a rate of a few per year. And if you look at your current business plan, only a few years later, you have 52 streets represented in your current business plan that you've been reviewing. You also asked for a $1 million briefing note to look at additional traffic calming, which adds about another 50 some odd streets, bringing you to a total potential consideration this year of 100 streets for traffic calming. Obviously, at the time the AO was first developed, that was nowhere to be seen. And so we also have learned that and done the math at the encouragement of council to understand that under the current AO, there'd be about 2,900 streets that qualify for traffic calming, which would be fine if our program was only coming through a ranked process. In other words, every street we did was ranked. That's not exactly how it works. As you heard, through our street recap program and doing significant numbers of complete streets each year, that means that as streets come up for recap, we're adding qualifying streets to the list. What that means, if we don't have tight guidance on which streets we are to consider for traffic calming, it means we could be taking, you know, very precious resources and applying them to very low priorities. And that's something that we don't want to. We want to make sure that we are aligned to where how council wants us to carry out this program, given the sudden magnitude of the program. So that's what this presentation is all about. Is our thoughts based on jurisdictional scan and just things we're learning and seeing as we go through the ramp up of this program and the ramp up of our resources to do it, to give you our thoughts here today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jody DeBay, who is our road safety and transportation engineer. She will be giving the presentation. I am also joined on the call by Tasso Kucherlakis, who is the manager of traffic management. Over to you, Jody.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jody DeBay, and as mentioned, I'm a program engineer on HRM's road safety and transportation team. I'm here today to provide a review of HRM's traffic calming policy. Next slide, please. Administrative Order number 2015-004-OP respecting traffic calming was adopted in 2016. The first projects implemented under the policy were constructed in 2017. The policy has been revised twice since inception. In 2018, the resident polling aspect of the policy was removed after there were concerns raised with the response rates received. This revision also added consideration for transit routes and introduced a reduced speed criteria for school zones. The policy was revised again in 2019 to reduce the speed thresholds for all assessments. Under the current version of the policy, the majority of all local and minor collector residential streets qualify for traffic calming measures. Next slide, please. Under the current policy, a resident of a street or the area councillor can request an assessment. If the street passes the initial screening criteria, speed and volume data is collected. When the minimum speed threshold is met, points are assigned for the category shown here, and the sum of the points is used to rank streets and prioritize projects. Next slide, please. To date, traffic calming measures have been installed on 59 streets, and measures are planned for 52 more streets in 2021. An additional 255 streets have been assessed and ranked. 209 streets are pending data collection, which has recently resumed. Next slide, please. This table provides a summary of the requests received, as well as the number of streets that have had measures installed each year. You can see that the number of requests has remained relatively consistent throughout the years, while the number of annual installations has grown. Note that the numbers shown here are accurate to December 31st, 2020, and duplicate requests are not included. Next slide, please. Staff collects follow-up speed and volume data to evaluate the effectiveness of measures installed. Since the data collection program was suspended last year, there are several evaluations pending. This pie chart summarizes the results collected to date. Thus far, 17% of streets evaluated have seen no change or a small increase in speed. 33% have shown a reduction of 1 to 5 kilometers per hour. 21% had a speed reduction of 6 to 10 kilometers per hour. Another 21% had a speed reduction of 11 to 15 kilometers per hour, and 8% had a speed reduction of 16 to 20 kilometers per hour. Next slide, please. This chart shows the speed reduction achieved based on the original measured 85th percentile speed. The largest speed reductions have been observed when the original 85th percentile speed is above 56 kilometers per hour. Lower speed reductions were observed on streets with an original 85th percentile speed below 55 kilometers per hour. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the first installations were constructed in 2017. The budgets have been increasing steadily since then. Since 2018, traffic calming measures have been tendered for about 10 streets per year. The first projects with horizontal deflections were introduced in 2019 and 2020, and the additional cost of those is reflected in the table shown. Horizontal deflections include curb extensions or bump outs, which are more beneficial in urban areas and on collector roads. However, the construction includes new concrete curbs, pedestrian ramps, catch basins, etc., which results in an increased cost to construct in comparison to asphalt speed humps and tables that are installed easily. Note that traffic calming measures integrated within other capital projects are not included in the total shown. Those costs are captured within those project budgets. Next slide, please. Based on the costs of the installations to date, staff have estimated that installing traffic calming measures on each of the currently ranked streets will cost approximately $18 million. It is important to remember the 209 streets that are still awaiting assessment. Assuming most, if not all of them, will qualify for ranking, it is likely that the cost to implement the entire ranked list could easily double. If the majority of all local and minor collector streets within HRM continue to qualify for traffic calming measures, the cost to complete this program could reach $127 million. Next slide, please. Through the first 5 years of implementing this policy, staff have noted some lessons learned. First and foremost, the low speed threshold has made the ranking list unmanageable, and based on the results gathered to date, minimal impact has been observed on those low speed streets that have received traffic calming measures. This has led to setting unrealistic expectations for residents with respect to timelines for project implementation, and it has led to spending resources on lower priority streets at the expense of higher priority pavement rehabilitations and traffic safety projects. Collision frequency and the potential for vulnerable road users to be present have little weight under the current system, and bicycle routes are not considered at all. Having vehicle speeds as the dominant factor is resulting in rural cross sections with high speeds and no to low pedestrian generators ranking at the top. High speed concerns. The 85th percentile speed is used to rank streets, which is industry standard. The 85th percentile speed is the speed at which 85% of vehicles are traveling at or below, and therefore the highest 15% of vehicles are not factored into the ranking, so periodic high speeders are not directly considered. Next slide, please. In continuation, the single street approach is leading to unintended consequences on nearby streets, and while staff make every effort to identify these impacts upfront, they are sometimes not predicted or the level of impact is underestimated. Community engagement. While the response rate for polling was insufficient, removing it altogether is leading to some residents feeling left out of the process. Lastly, this policy doesn't support some of HRM's other policies as well as it could. For example, the Strategic Road Safety Plan has a goal to reduce fatal and injury collisions by 20% within 5 years. The traffic calming policy does assign some points for collisions. However, they have little weight in the overall ranking, so locations with high frequency or high severity collisions are not necessarily being targeted. Similarly, one of the pillars of the Integrated Mobility Plan is to develop healthy communities in which people can easily walk or bicycle to nearby destinations. And while reducing vehicle speeds will enhance the environment for other road users, the current policy isn't necessarily targeting locations where alternate modes of transportation are viable options for residents. Next slide, please. Staff have conducted a jurisdictional scan to review traffic calming policies in similar cities across Canada. Policies from Ottawa, Hamilton, St. John's, Saskatoon, Calgary, London, Kingston, and Winnipeg were reviewed. It is interesting to note that St. John's and Kingston have also identified issues with their traffic calming policies and growing ranking lists, so they are currently reviewing their policies. Winnipeg has also recently reviewed their policies and is in the early stages of implementing changes. Next slide, please. Overall, the traffic calming policies reviewed have a similar goal of reducing vehicle speeds in residential areas. Some other similarities that were found between HRM's current policy and others in Canada include street classifications, a need to not impede emergency services, direction to integrate traffic calming measures in other capital projects, and the use of primarily permanent measures. Next slide, please. Some differences that were identified. Most other jurisdictions have either a neighborhood-based program or a combination of neighborhood-based and street-specific programs. All areas reviewed have a minimum 85th percentile thresholds at or above the posted speed limit. Most other jurisdictions allot more points for pedestrian generators and pedestrian infrastructure. Some assign points for cycling routes. These cities also cap the number of points available for vehicle speed to better distribute emphasis on all road users. And all areas reviewed have some form of community engagement. Typically, petitions before assessments are completed to gauge community interest, and surveys and/or public engagement sessions to confirm community support before measures are installed. Next slide, please. Staff is of the opinion that a policy review is required. Based on the lessons learned, as well as what has been seen in other jurisdictions, the following changes should be considered. First, based on the data collected to date, measures on low-speed streets have had minimal impact on vehicle speeds. This indicates that work on low-impact streets is being conducted at the expense of higher priority traffic calming and road safety projects or pavement rehabilitation projects. Staff proposed that the minimum speed threshold be reinstated to 45 kilometers per hour. An assessment of high speeders should also be reviewed and considered. Staff would like to reconsider how points are assigned within the ranking system to better balance the needs of all road users. A higher number of points should be allotted for the presence of pedestrian generators, such as schools and playgrounds. Higher points should also be allotted for the absence of pedestrian infrastructure. Allocating points for some bicycle routes should be considered. By placing more emphasis on all road users, the traffic calming policy will better support the integrated mobility plan. More points should be assigned for collision frequency and severity. Targeting areas with higher collision frequency will better support the goal of the strategic road safety plan. Next, the single street approach should be reconsidered. When reviewing a traffic calming project, the entire neighborhood should be considered as opposed to individual streets to better mitigate impacts. Staff understands that school zones are a priority. The intent of incorporating a decreased speed threshold in school zones was to help them rank higher in the system, but in practice, that has not happened. How school zones are assessed should be reconsidered. Finally, staff noted that Ottawa and Winnipeg apply an equity lens to better prioritize projects. This should be considered for HRM's traffic calming policy as well. Staff understand that it is Council's desire to remain nimble in the implementation of this policy, and that the plan is to maintain and even increase our current pace of installations. Incorporating petitions or pollings will greatly decrease the rate at which projects can be completed, so we believe that changes to the community engagement portion of the policy are not desired by Regional Council at this time. Next slide, please. Based on the scale of the changes proposed, it is anticipated that a new administrative order is required and will be ready for Council review later this year. Shifting to a new policy will require a transition plan. Staff are suggesting the following. The existing ranking list should remain in place until a new policy is complete. Planning for next year projects typically commences in the summer prior, so all 2022 projects will be based on the existing ranking list. Staff will continue to receive requests and collect speed and volume data. However, all outstanding 2020 requests and all new 2021 requests will be assessed under the new criteria when it is available. Finally, all streets remaining on the existing ranking list will be reassessed under the new criteria. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Bay. Lots to talk about there, I'm sure. We have a number of councillors on the speakers list. So we will go to Councillor Mancini first to start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jody and Brad and Tasso. And for Brad and Tasso's purposes, I want you both to understand how much I appreciate Ms. DeBay and the way she interacts with me personally and my district. She's always very responsive, and sometimes we have to get into some delicate communication with our residents when it comes up to this topic, but she's always game. So I want you both to know how much I appreciate Jody's work. Thank you very much for the presentation. So a couple of questions. I'm trying to understand, I understand the issues that we have with the current AO. What's the, by putting in these new, this new AO, what's the end result that you're looking for? What will be different? So right now we have the long list. It'll take us forever. Most of us, our political career will be long gone before we get through the list at the current AO. What's going to be different now if we come up with a new AO? Because it still comes down to time and money too, right? So it sounds like it, for me, it's prioritized differently. Well, how is it different? And what's going to be different? What's your vision?
So I'll start, and I'm sure Jody can kick in with the details, but essentially what we're trying to do in a nutshell is give better traffic calming results, better traffic calming value for money spent. Bottom line, this is about making sure that we are going into the areas where we are going to have the biggest impact, and we're not taking lower priority, having lower priority outcomes at the expense of where it's really needed. And if we're hearing, this is one of the key pieces that I hear at my office is, why this street when their problem is nowhere near what ours is. And that's the challenge when you're coming at such a diverse number of streets, 2,900. You've heard me say it before, we're dealing with priority one and arguably through the rank list, while at the same time, we could be addressing priority 2,900 if they were ranked all at once through the capital program. And so that's where the nonsensical piece of it really begins for us, because again, if we were ranking them all independently, that's one thing. The challenge is we don't want to bypass any streets of a decent priority through our street recap program. That's the time to hit them, is when we're mobilized and we're redoing that street. The challenge is with the current thresholds in the policy and some of the weighting factors, we're going into areas that really, quite frankly, based on, you saw Jody's pie chart there, we're having limited to no impact whatsoever. And so that is not, while it may be desired and while communities may value it, it's not a good spend of resources, especially where councillors still clearly have high priorities on the list that they want to address and they want addressed quickly. And so taking some of those low value streets and get them done is really slowing us down and getting to, where you want us to get to within your communities. So I'll kick it over to Jody, see if she has anything extra to add.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I would add is the greater emphasis on other road users, because right now we are really just looking at vehicle speed, and I think that we should be looking at pedestrians and other users as well.
What about the tools and solutions that are tried also? The bump outs, the humps, the temporary versus more permanent solutions. Is there any change to that? Are they proven to be the right tools to use to try to do the traffic calming? When you did your jurisdictional scan, are you seeing anybody else doing anything different than from what we're already doing here?
Not yet. Typically what I see is most of the other jurisdictions are just using permanent measures. They've got other programs that use temporary measures for more tactical type projects. I haven't had, I'd still like to do some more engagement with the other jurisdictions to get a better feel for how well their measures are in place. But based on what we've seen so far, I think that doing permanent measures is going in the right direction.
Am I out of time, Mr. Chair? Yeah, I can't hear you. Sorry.
You know, I was just trying to figure that out, and I think you probably are. If you could come back
Okay.
for a second round, and I will actually run the timer properly this time for the next person. We'll go to the deputy mayor, who I'm sure will be strictly on 5 minutes.
Absolutely, maybe even less. Listen, thanks very much for the presentation, Jody. And first of all, I like that barrel art of the fish behind you. We collect barrel art up at our summer place, so I really like that. Secondly, folk art and barrel art. So thank you for that. And I know you and Brad and Tasso and others, you're really trying to improve things, and there have been significant improvements, and that is appreciated. And I'm glad this is here today because we have to keep moving down the road of improvements. And as I've said to my colleagues, Lisa and to Tony and to Kathy, we have got to get our act together when it comes to building new communities going forward as well. West Bedford being the example where now we've got streets being built that are already people screaming for traffic calming, and they're not even 2 to 5 years old, some of them. So I hope we'll have our act together better and be building streets and designing streets differently for Murchison Drive, for Port Wallace, etc. So just my little plug there to help my colleagues. The other little pet peeve that'll come to no surprise is Brad and Tasso is that we still need a solution, an affordable solution for schools on hills. I don't like the double standard is if you're not on a hill and you can have a cheap solution. If your school is on a hill, it's more expensive, more complicated, but no less important. So we've got to keep working on that one. The $18 million factor is funny, maybe I've been around too long, but the $18 million stat that you mentioned there, the 127 million is quite scary and obviously not realistic, but 18 million is less than we spend in 1 year on paving. So that doesn't shock me that much that we are at some point going to have to spend $18 million on street calming. That there's no big sticker shock to me on that. Maybe there should be. I loved your comments on if we're setting expectations. The existing policy is setting expectations with the public and council. It's not fair, and we have to deal with that through amendments to the AO. I'm quite surprised, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but the present evaluations being done don't factor in if there's a school, if there's a lot of pedestrians, if there's a park or playground, if there's no sidewalk. I thought when it came to sidewalks, when it came to street calming and whatnot, we certainly looked at those things in addition to just the raw data, if you will, of the 85th percentile. So if we're not looking at that presently, we darn well should be, in my opinion. I do not support, and I don't think it's part of your recommendations, us going back and doing surveys and voting on if people want to deal with the issue. I fought hard to get this changed a few years ago when Bruce was in Brad's position, and the fact that we ask people to vote on whether they believe something should be done about something that's illegal and dangerous really irks me and drives me the wrong way, because everybody wants speed calming, they just don't want it in front of their house. So that's the kind of answers we're going to get, and that will skew any kind of community consultation we get. So I don't think you're recommending that going forward, but if you are, I will be strongly opposed to that. When it comes to the new AO, there's a couple things that concern me. If we raise the threshold, if you will, to 45 instead of 40, where are we going with the red book that's being redone, though? Are we going to try to design streets to continue to be built for 50? Are we going to try and drop them down to 45? Are we going to try and drop it to 40? I think whatever we do as far as this AO should be somewhat consistent with where we're heading with the new red book, the number as well. And when you're setting the priorities, when these are on a list, what are we going to do with situations whereas this little street qualifies and it needs a $10,000 solution of a couple of standard regular speed bumps, let's say, but this street, because of its nature, what type of street it is, the traffic it gets and whatnot, needs a $110,000 solution. It needs bump outs, it needs a table, these sort of things. So how are we going to deal with those differences when it comes to the proposed new AO? So anyway, I think you're on the right track. Just a few questions there, and thanks for the presentation. How's that, Mr. Chair?
That sounds great.
So,
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Tasso.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Tasso Koutrelakis, Director of Traffic Management. So I'll take these questions, given that I know that Jody wasn't involved in some of these discussions as it relates to.
And they're all loaded questions. I know, Tasso, I know.
No, absolutely. No, so with respect to the community engagement, you're absolutely right, Councillor. We did finish off by saying that base what we heard at the time and what we continue to hear from various counselors, that this is something that you don't want to consider. So that, from our concern, that's something that we're not going to consider as part of this revised AO, because this is the feedback that we've been getting. So again, this is the reason why we're here today, just to confirm that. Okay. With respect to the AO, it's the current AO itself. Yes, it does consider pedestrian volumes in schools and sidewalks, but the scoring system is a little bit upside down, right? So what we want to do is tweak that and even cap some of the scores. So, for example, a lot of the jurisdictions that we surveyed, for speeding, for example, you can get up to a maximum of 10 points, for example, right? So we want to do something the same. So that's why it'll hopefully readjust the priority list to put a little bit more emphasis on the pedestrian realm, because what we said during our budget and business plan and presentation is that a lot of the traffic calming projects that we currently do, and at the beginning, near the top of the list, are more in suburban and rural areas where there's no sidewalk and and very few pedestrians. It is strictly dominated by speed. And by the way, not that we shouldn't be doing anything there, but it's just a little bit. We're going to have to revisit it and tweak it. It just doesn't make sense to us. With respect to the red book, yeah, so we're working through that right now. So as you know, planning and development are leading those discussions. I know we've had some initial discussions with our colleagues at planning and development with respect to cross-section and design standards. So that is something that we're working through right now, right? And obviously, we should be designing for lower design speed on these local residential streets, because otherwise you're just going to end up with West Bedford again. Right. Yeah. So that's something that we're working through right now. And with respect to your question related to a small street, whether or not vertical and horizontal deflections, I mean, at the end of the day, the ranked list is the ranked list. So as you know, we have two processes whereby we have a standalone projects where we tackle as part of our road safety budget. And then we have integration projects that, working with our colleagues in project planning design, to identify those projects, and they incorporate that in their budget, right? So I don't see anything changing from that. Now, I should point out though that, if all of a sudden though they have a whole lot of projects floating to the top of the list that require intense design work, then that's something. Yeah, so there may be a situation where we can only do so many of those types of streets in a matter of a year, and have to go down the list to tackle some of those easier ones that involve speed humps and speed tables that don't really involve a whole lot of design work.
That's my exact concern. What impacts they're going to have. But thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the answers. Thank you. See, that wasn't so bad. Thanks.
No, yes, thank you. Very kind. And thank you, Councillor Outfit, for keeping it to 4 minutes and 10 seconds is what that was. So next on the list will be Councillor Russell. Councillor Russell, please.
Thank you. My stopwatch is broken, so I'm not going to be tracking my time. I do appreciate, oh gosh, there's another stopwatch. Okay. I do appreciate that you're bringing this AO forward. I do appreciate that it is being reviewed. Recognizing and trying to improve on whatever the process is always a big step forward. I also appreciate some of what I heard through the presentation. In fact, a fair amount of it. And one of the things that particularly caught my attention was that you're not looking at individual streets. You're looking at a more broad range than streets. We have two streets here in Lower Sackville that are connected at one end and connected at the other end. And what happens with those two streets, one of them is on the traffic calming list, but two people will start at the bottom and one will go up each street, and they will race to see if they can meet at the top. If we apply traffic calming to one of those streets, everybody is going to be racing on the other street. So I do appreciate that you're looking at a more broad view than one street at a time. I would also appreciate it if you would consider the difference between neighborhoods. So we have a number of neighborhoods downtown where bike lanes, for example, are suitable and make the street more narrow and allow for different types of traffic calming measures, because you get predominantly a pedestrian, a cyclist, someone who is not using a car, or rather a higher preponderance of them downtown and closer to the core. As you get further out, as you get out here in Sackville, where everything is a bedroom community and you drive pretty much everywhere, or further afield still in Councillor Daigle-Gammon's or Councillor Hensby's district, where I think they still use a horse. The traffic calming measures would be a little bit different. I was wondering what the reaction to that would be. So I would appreciate it if there was some difference being paid to the to what is done based on a neighborhood, not just on a couple of streets. What types of measures are important? We've also talked a lot about vertical deflections and horizontal deflections, and I was pleased to see that alternates to that were being considered. One of them was a vertical post sticking up in the middle of a crosswalk, which I thought was a great idea in the right location. One of them, we've got a street out here that was in the $1 million overs list, where we're taking a wide street on the and just making it more narrow. I think that's a great idea. On a lot of streets, the vertical deflections and the horizontal deflections are not the best solution. So looking at alternates makes a lot of sense. One of the other things that I have heard is with the vertical deflections that were put in place over the past couple of years, they are so low and so widespread, 3 inches up over 8 meters across, that they don't have any impact. So I'm not surprised that the results reflect that they aren't showing the types of slowdowns that we would hope to see. So residents in those neighborhoods, even those with the speed humps in front of their houses, would like to see them be more pronounced, would like to go back to the kind of thing that is a speed bump. Now, I get that there are challenges with emergency services, but having something more than more effective, more pronounced than the speed humps that we have is something that I would hope to see. So I would hope that that type of thing would be considered. I don't really have any questions. Those are my comments and observations, and thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Councillor Russell. 3 minutes, 58 seconds. We'll now go to Councillor Kent for her first go round.
Thank you. And Councillor Kent wants to advise the chair that Councillor Russell said I could have his time added to mine.
Did he?
Yeah, he did.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Just saying.
Let's debate that and use up that minute.
Administrative
Okay.
order one.
You're
I'll
using
give
up
these
time.
5 seconds
Don't
back
you
to you,
start-
though, Councillor Kent.
Thank you. Don't you start. Listen, thank you, Mr. Chair. Brad and your team, I really appreciate that. Just that we're having this opportunity for this conversation. I've been rather vocal about my concerns around traffic calming. I have to say, every day I feel like it's escalating, and more people. I don't know if that's because they're seeing me talk about it, they're hearing me talk about it, or they're just wishing that we were changing things. But I really appreciate that you're putting energy into this. Brad, you've been super open to having lots of conversations around it. I do have some questions that I'm going to just sort of pitch out there and see if you can answer some of them after I'm finished. But so I am not aware. I just need a little education on some of the temporary measures that might be able to be used. I'm not aware. Maybe I'm aware of them and I don't think of them as temporary. I'm not 100% sure. But I think that generally speaking, and this is around the conversation of community expectations, resident expectations, we do have to manage it. And I think that education can come with that. The expectation is that every street that has a need for traffic calming will automatically qualify for some of these more prevalent ones, the bumps, the humps, the bump outs, and those. I do get a lot of complaints around almost escalated activity, maybe certain repeat offenders. So the temporary solutions could be really helpful in those situations where we may have 1 or 2 vehicles in a neighborhood that's really wreaking havoc on the street safety. So I feel like I need some feedback on when we review the streets and they may not qualify because of the system that's in place now on the value. How do we ascertain or come to conclusion that this could possibly be just, one or two repeat drivers who are causing the distress on the street? And that could come from us as counselors, I'm not sure. I have a situation, for instance, that, and this is the second part of this question, what role does the HRP and or the RCMP play in the decision-making around assessment? It's not uncommon for us to reach out as counselors to HRP or RCMP in my situation, my case in District 3, to put a little effort into addressing putting a car in that area, taking some speed data, collecting some speed data. 9 times out of 10, they're never there when those situations are happening. Like when there's a repeat offender that's coming in, it's hard to coordinate that kind of effort to be able to really measure what's happening. So I'm wondering if you can just clarify some of that. Unintentional impact is very, very real. There's no question that when we fix something on one street, it tends to move to another. I feel like that's kind of like our rodent problem. We can deal with it in our own yard, but then we're probably just chasing it up the street. So a neighborhood approach, I think, is really important. I'm a little unsure, and it could be my newness to the council again, on what engagement you actually do with the community and residents now, and what would that look like in a new policy, for instance. The other question, and I think, Brad, you and I have touched on this before, and I just need a reminder, but we talked about the need for traffic calming on some of our collector streets. Baker Drive is a perfect example. It is awful. It is terrifying to be a pedestrian out and about on those streets, and the speed at which the cars are traveling. There's some blind hills and such, but it wouldn't qualify. And I think, if I recall correctly, we had some discussion on coming up with some form of a solution on that. So I would like how much time? You're muted.
Coming up on 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm actually at the end of my first round of questions, so maybe I can have some comments back on those things.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Jody, did you want to lead and I'll follow up with the last part?
Sure. I think I can cover most of that. So the first question was with respect to the types of temporary measures that we use and when we choose to use those. We have just started using like the tactical bollards that they sort of bolt to the asphalt, and they're a bit flexible to build bump outs. We haven't yet used temporary speed humps, but the time that we use a temporary measure is when we're in anticipation of a future project, or we know that there's going to be a paving project in 2-3 years and we want to get ahead of that and do something. So the other time we would want to do that if we need to test a measure. So for example, we've got some flexible bollards out in District 6 right now because the street is a primary emergency response route. So we wanted to be absolutely certain that we weren't impeding their emergency services before we go in with concrete. So generally speaking, we have been only using them less often than more, and it's in anticipation of future work. With respect to your question about repeat offenders, that is our intent of considering a high speed threshold. So right now we look at the 85th percentile. That's 85% of vehicles are driving at or below that. So those periodic high speeders aren't captured at all. But we also measure something that's called the 95th percentile. So we may be able to assign some points to those higher speeders to see if that would bring a street higher on a priority list. You asked about how the police factor in the decision-making process. The police aren't directly involved in the traffic calming policy right now. I say that except we do, if we observe high speeds on a street, we will certainly share that information with the police and share the data that we have with them. But the idea is to build a street that we don't need to spend police resources on to monitor speed. So we want to install physical measures that regulate themselves. And with respect to what the engagement process is right now, the way the policy is written, a resident of a street or the area councillor can call and ask to have the street assessed. Once that happens, we move forward with our assessment and put it on the list. The next time that residents hear from us is when we're getting ready to move forward with the project, and they get a letter indicating that the project is coming. So there's no other engagement piece for residents to engage with. And I'll leave the collector streets to Brad.
Okay, thanks, Jody. Yeah, so in terms of the traffic calming AO, as Jody outlined, it only deals with residential streets and minor collectors. So that leaves many of our neighborhoods that have significant infrastructure that is either a major collector or an arterial. And of course, there's not much happening there. And when we hear that from the councillors on a regular and consistent basis. So obviously step one is our venture into the photo enforcement world. Even though the legislation has not been passed or proclaimed by the province, we, in our business plan, assuming it goes through as currently constructed and approved by council, we intend to undertake an implementation study this year to understand exactly what we need to do to make this happen. And by photo enforcement, I just want to be clear that involves both the potential for speeding and for red light cameras. And of course, we'll be working in a committee with the police in moving forward with that. That will, without a doubt, based on all of the studies, have an impact, a significant impact in those areas. As well, though, in the meantime, we have our dynamic speed display sign program still in its infancy, but we're writing our procedures now to make that a little bit smoother and more understandable. Now with that, the dynamic speed display signs, there's only so many you can put out before you kind of saturate and it becomes meaningless. But those remain a tool that we have used in certain collectors and arterials. And of course, we have our intersection strategy where still from our collisions, the majority of our collisions are happening at our intersections. We're burning through those in a priority basis. We started on the top 10 last year. We've got videographic analysis on another 10 that we should be receiving the data very soon. And we're putting programs together for those intersections. And those intersections tend to line up on some of our more, if you will, dangerous or high speed major collectors and arterials. So it's not like there's nothing happening there. We just don't have the same kind of toolkit available to us like the traffic calming AO has. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Brad. I'm next, and then we'll go to Mancini, and then second goes for Mancini and Kent. And I'll start the clock just so that Councillor Russell doesn't make fun of me later. So Councillor Austin has been saying that we're not really talking about traffic calming. We're talking about bad road design repair, right? Like at the same time as we're talking about changing the red book and potentially changing what I think we should do, council's already voted to ask that we have a posted speed limit of 40 kilometers an hour on residential. So the target design speed of the red book should be 40 kilometers an hour. And that's why that was the intent of changing the percentages, was we want people to be driving more slowly, and we wanted to post that. And then it has these these unfortunate knock-on consequences about how resources are being allocated. So to me, I've always said this is going to be this is generational, right? They started doing this. I always mention the Plateau of Montreal. I always talk about Annex in Toronto. You always talk about the neighborhoods in Vancouver that have done this, but we are just starting now, and they didn't make all those things happen overnight. So $100 million bill doesn't panic me too much if it's built into repaving and if it's built into a 25 or 30 year span. But that doesn't mean that we can't do a better job. I like the idea of a matrix. I like the idea of looking at more than one measure to determine where the money should be spent. I'm wondering if there was any correlations between the type of traffic calming and the streets where there was no experience, where they didn't experience any change. Like, are people actually speeding more where we put speed humps, right? The urban myth of they get over the speed hump and they floor it to make up the time they lost? Or is that more on the vertical deflections? Like I hear from people, I know from the measurement that on Vernon Street bike lane, because that's public, because it's a local street bikeway, that it hasn't really impacted speeds at all. It's only impacted the traffic volume. So I'm interested in that as a question. I really like the idea of doing a neighborhood approach instead of single street approach, but that means that we're going to have to, the matrix is going to have to be on a neighborhood basis, not on a street basis. And that's so much more complicated. I can't even imagine. And that comes to something else that Councillor Austin and I have been talking about a lot, which is, so the first house I remember living in was on Birchwood Terrace, in Dartmouth, right by Brightwood. And they're about to get a sidewalk, I think, this year. And the first municipal campaign I remember is my mom had a pin on for a woman who ran for Dartmouth City Council trying to get a sidewalk on Birchwood Terrace in 1977. She didn't win the election, and it's only going in this year. But so the discussion we've been having is that the right thing to do, right? It's going to happen, but the cost of that sidewalk, and then the sidewalk that will connect, and I forget the name of the cross street, that'll connect to Lingby so those kids can walk to school. I walked in the street in the winter with my sister in grade 1 and down to the Keys, and then we picked them up, and our parents didn't walk with us, and it was fine, I guess. I mean, we thought it was fine, but that's going to be $1 million project or a multi-$100,000 project. You could do all of Creighton Park with speed humps for the same amount of money and make the streets safe. So my pitch to you is, when we're looking at this, if we include volume of traffic and pedestrian traffic and speeding and destinations and schools and all those things, and then we rank these communities, these neighborhoods, can we talk about also a pedestrian street hierarchy? Like, my understanding is that our traffic analysts, and I know Tassel's on the call, are uncomfortable saying that these are shared streets. But where my in-laws live, where I grew up in Dartmouth, and where my in-laws live in Hammond's Plains, where there's a ditch, you're not putting a sidewalk there ever. And so we should be designing the roads and signing it and telling people, expect pedestrians in the roads, because where else are they going to walk? And it's allowed under the Motor Vehicle Act, though. The walking in this, can't tell people in those neighborhoods to walk only on the oncoming traffic side of the road or whatever. But so to me, it's also, I think the sidewalk piece is important too, because I don't think we need sidewalks everywhere. I don't. I think that that's not a good use of resources. And in a lot of rural, you can't, because you'd have to get rid of the ditches and do drainage and a whole bunch of stuff that's very expensive. And so, with all those things in mind, looking at the matrix, I wonder whether or not we can talk about, making those investments on a neighborhood basis. And looking at if there isn't a volume of traffic, but if there's reasons to be doing traffic calming, in some cases a sidewalk might be a part of it, or in some cases we might be making investments to avoid having to build a sidewalk. It would not be necessary. Anyway, lots of thoughts on this. It's a great discussion so far. I thank you for bringing this to us. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on any of these questions or comments, I guess.
Thank you. I'll take the first piece and leave the second to Tasso. So with respect to evaluations based on the type of measures that we've installed, we've only installed horizontal deflections on a small number of streets, and that kind of coincided with COVID. So because we still have the evaluations pending and the data collection pending, the majority of what we've measured is on speed hump streets.
Yeah, everybody's speeding everywhere right now. I just did a tour around the neighborhood, and because people aren't going to work like they normally do, and there isn't as much street parking, all the streets are wide open, and I was shocked at how much people were speeding because they can. Anyway.
And I think
yes, Mr. Chair, with respect to whether a street requires a sidewalk or not, again, that's part of the Red Book discussion and which we will be talking about. I mean, yeah, you're right. At the end of the day, does a cul-de-sac need a sidewalk? I speak from experience. I don't have a sidewalk. Does it need one? Probably not. So I hear from what you're saying. So I know that PPD is project plan design is looking. They handle all the sidewalk criteria piece with respect to where a sidewalk is needed. Obviously, that would be part of the Red Book design standards.
Thank you. And for the record, I used non-District 7 examples, but there are plenty of streets in District 7 that don't have sidewalks. And when the neighbors come to me and they want them, I push back because I'm like, well, there's only 20 cars a day on that street by the Northwest Arm. I don't think we need a sidewalk there. We need other deflections or traffic calming or whatever. So thank you very much for that. We'll go for a second go around to Councillor Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in your presentation, Jody, you talked about what happens when we get to the creating a new list. I guess my question is, when a new AO puts it in place and it's a new criteria to determine the list, what does happen to the old list at that point in time? I mean, and so because you're going to have some people that watch very closely, some of our residents watch very closely every year, where is their street on the list? And they're getting close. They've been at it for 6 years now, and they're getting close. And then we're going to come up with a new list and new criteria, which I support the direction you're going with the new AOs. What happens to the old list, new AOs in place?
So our suggestion is to reconsider the streets that are on the old list under the new criteria and then reassess them based on the new criteria to see where they will fall. With respect to residents watching closely where their streets rank, you're right, that happens in some cases, and that's great. But our current list is very flexible as it is, because as a new street is assessed, it gets inserted where it lands based on its scoring. So I've got a ranking list of 255 right now, and over 200 more are going to be inserted. So the reality is that most of the rankings that are there now are going to be different.
Yeah, I knew the answer to that question, of course, but I guess it's the communication piece, and you and I talked about communication a lot, Jody. So my other question is,
Tony Tasso just came on. I think he also wants to break your heart.
Yeah, Tasso's not gonna break my heart. My buddy's not.
Yeah, and what I wanted to say is this: is that we have to pause it and have a transition, because in fairness to Dave Hubling and his team, in order to plan for the following year's capital budget, we need to get our list of projects and have it pretty solid by the summer, right? And so that's why we're saying, we have the significant backlog of streets that were paused due to COVID. Thankfully, as of last week, we have a full data collection team in place. They're in the process of being trained, and then we're going to let them loose and start collecting data. So by the time all of that work happens and we go through the if we were to go through a ranking process, that's not going to happen until like late fall, winter. That's really too late for us, right? So that's why we're saying for the 2022-23 capital program, we're going to base it on the current rank list that we have. Yeah. But we'll still continue to do all the data collection in the background. And then if and when Regional Council approves a new AO, then we can take that AO and re-rank the streets. Yeah, and I share your concerns, Council. I mean, yeah, Jody's put it. She was correct in saying that. Yeah, the current list is very fluid, but with having a different ranking system, there's a potential for it to be even more fluid. Like have something near the bottom, go to the top, and vice versa. I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Thank you both. The next question is around, and you alluded to, Jody, and I try not to use examples of my own district also, but District 6 on Montebello with the green bollards, and your explanation of why we want to test it first makes perfect sense because of the emergency vehicles and all that. Though I see in some areas these green bollards on cement platforms, whereas in District 6 right now, they're fastened directly to the asphalt. And we saw the problems that caused during the winter this time around. Is there a different change of thought when we're testing using these green bollards that to start putting them on the cement platforms so that snow removal can get around them, not cause the same problem we had this past winter?
I think they're both tools that we have in the toolbox, and I'm hesitant to speak too much to the ones you've seen because they've been installed by a different group, so I don't know exactly exactly their intent. But yes, I've heard that the ones on concrete can be better for snow removal purposes. And if I recall correctly, some of the ones that were installed are in very, very high volume areas with a lot of pedestrians, so they do offer a little bit more protection.
Okay, and maybe that's an offline thing. Last very quick question, Mr. Chair, real quick. Just why the 2-year test period? Why do we need 2 years versus 1 year? And that's my last question, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Yes, it is.
This can be an offline discussion for your specific area as well. In that case, they were installed quite late in the season. I think they went in October or something. So just leaving them in through one winter and a part of a summer wouldn't really be enough time to assess them. And we do need to, it takes 2 years to do the permanent design as well. So it just gives us a bit more time for planning.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Brad, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, just maybe a little bit. The bollards being on the concrete block or directly into the ground. Simply stated, we're still working through it. 2 different designs with different problems. And what we're learning is, well, on one hand, having them on the concrete block, depending how that concrete block is designed, may help with snow clearing. At the same time, we've learned we can end up with serious drainage issues depending on how it's set up. We've also learned we can end up with serious street cleaning issues in order for access of our machinery, which meaning more handiwork if leaves and whatnot collect there. So we're really at an evaluation kind of stage, knowing which setup works best in which location. Just want to add to Jody's comments. One of the concerns I have, you're right, there's the issue of why has it got to be in 2 years? I'll just be clear on my position with both planning and development, tactical urbanism team and myself, is that we want to minimize that duration as much as possible. And where necessary, move this into more of a standard and basically move where possible straight forward to the right design without the need. Okay, so again, that's all part of the tactical urbanism program. As you go through it, you learn, and then you try to start to enable it. So I don't want anybody thinking there's always going to be a green baller, set of green ballers. So eventually, in cases where we feel confident in our design, we have enough experience, we'll go straight to the end product. We want to do that more and more based on just some of the experiences you saw in Montebello this year. If we don't need to go through that, then we're not going to go through the expense of it. So I just wanted to add that. The biggest thing is what we don't want to see is these things out there for years and years and years. We're trying to make sure that we look at our capital program and they're only put in a timeline that's reasonable ahead of when we know the capital works would come. So that, because we are getting complaints about how long they're there and obviously questions as to, it looks like we don't know what we're doing. So we're trying to comfort citizens by shortening that time as much as possible, and wherever possible, if we don't need to do it, we won't.
Glad to hear that, Brad. Glad to hear that, Brad. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mancini. Moving to Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions. One is around communication and messaging. One of the obvious things to me, and I've spoken about it before, is that traffic calming is a responsibility of the driver, of the communities, of the neighborhoods that are living there. In many cases, it's their neighbors that are speeding, etc. I know it doesn't necessarily fit within the context of this particular policy change, but I just want to know if there are conversations being had from your folks with around education pieces that we can utilize in the public to just bring more awareness back to the responsibility of driving safely, of being mindful of people, pedestrians in the crosswalks, in the areas that they're living, that children playing, and all of those things. So I'm a big fan right now of taking advantage of our extreme electronic era social media platforms that we have. People are tuned in. If we can get messaging out around traffic calming traffic, driving habits, being mindful and respectful and responsible for the safety of your own neighborhoods. It seems old school. It seems like we shouldn't have to go back to grassroots, but I think that it's a really important piece on changing behavior. So the next part is around what conversations are we having and what influence can you folks have on planning and development applications on new development? Can we're going to spend a lot of money on traffic calming in streets and neighborhoods after these roads are built. We are now. The street in District C that comes to mind right away is the Portland Hills Drive. Portland Hills Drive is built on a hill, so naturally it's going to be a little windy, but I think the windiness of it was also probably somewhat of an attempt to say, okay, we don't want a long streak, straight line like we have in Baker Drive, but yet it's actually kind of created an Indy 500 kind of a feel when you're going fast and you're driving up these windy streets. It's an attraction for some people. It would be really nice to get ahead of that and have some responsibility for our larger developments when they're building these larger roadways to have a role in putting some things in place as they're being developed, knowing that there is some potential for some speeding to take place on these roads. And do we have a collaborative effort between your departments and the planning and development folks?
Well, who'd like to take those?
Yeah, I'll take that, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so I heard two questions, one around education and one around planning and development and our collaboration with that group. That's what I heard. If not, Councillor, please let me know. With respect to education, yes, our corporate communications team is part of our road safety steering committee, and they have a real active role in the annual road safety plan. They do have a budget that is solely dedicated for road safety education campaign, and that involves all aspects of road safety, whether it's speeding, whether it's general messaging around say pedestrian safety to targeted type of messaging around speeding, etc. It just so happens that next week we're meeting with our colleagues from HRM Corporate Communications to discuss and review the upcoming 21-22 education campaign around road safety. And that will be reported back to TSC as part of our annual report in June. So that will be laid out for you to review. And if you have any questions at time, we will be more than happy to address. With respect to our relationship with planning development, yes, absolutely. We collaborate with planning development as the model is that they're the intake for all development applications, and they will circulate that information to us when required, right? So anything related to if it's a large development requiring a traffic impact study, that's circulated to our staff to review and provide comment. Even basic roadway design, driveway access, etc. We provide feedback through that process. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tasso. Moving to Councillor Stoddard for first go around.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the committee and staff. I have a question. I'm going to be specific about my district. Concerned about the St. Margaret's Bay Road and the speed in which residents travel. I know it's getting repaved, a good portion of it anyway, and I think this is a street calming opportunity. What happens at the current time is residents take the Beachville and Lakeside exit to avoid going up to the Timberley Parkway and having to wait in traffic, especially rush hour, morning, etc. So they're leaving a highway at about 110K, coming off the exit, which takes them into a 50K, which is St. Margaret's Bay Road. And sometimes they slow down to 70K. So wondering what we might do to do some traffic calming in that area. I think if there was some traffic calming, that they might decide to continue down the highway and take their chances at the intersection there at Timberley Parkway. Maybe not, but I think we should make some type of effort to do something while that road's being paved. Please.
Thank you for that. The quick answer is that the traffic calming policy right now only applies to local and minor collector streets, and St. Margaret's Bay Road would be an arterial or a major collector. So from a traffic calming policy perspective, it wouldn't qualify. But as was mentioned previously, we are looking at other options for the higher classification streets.
Yeah. I'm just, where they're paving it, I thought, if something could be done, even a little test something, just while the opportunity was there. Anyway, thank you.
I can get back to you to speak in more specifics about that project. I'm not aware of what's happening during that paving project, but we can circle back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Outfit for your second go around.
Thank you, Chair. First thing I want to do is add my strong support for your comments regarding the integration between street calming and sidewalks. I mean, quite often when I get a response, it's, well, Tim, could you not, some people have sidewalks and they're still concerned with speeding, don't get me wrong. But in many cases, it's, Tim, we don't even have a sidewalk in old parts of Bedford, in old parts of, other parts of my district. They don't have the sidewalk. And I think there's an opportunity here. And I don't know if Brad or Tasso or Jody can speak to this, but have they ever sat down or shared a spreadsheet with their 455 list with Dave Hughley's 400 list, and saw where there might be some economies of scale here to say, these people really don't need a sidewalk. What they're doing is they're worried about speeding, and perhaps vice versa. So I'd love to hear the response to that from somebody in a minute. The other thing is, Brad mentioned that you're going to have to start getting some planning for the new technology that's coming. Well, Council's been pushing a lot now for this new Traffic Safety Act and the regulations and the proclamation of the act so we can start doing cameras. Well, then we better be ready with the cameras, and we better be ready with the policies for the cameras, because as soon as the regulations are passed and this is proclaimed, then all the MLAs and the provincial bureaucrats are going to say, okay, HRM, it's over to you. You can't blame us anymore longer. You've got the power to implement these. What are you going to do? So I'd like to just remind Brad that in addition to working on the policies, which he's mentioned, I think police and traffic are going to have to get together and start coming together with some capital requests as well for this technology. And the other thing is the other big question we get, and I know you can relate to this, Mr. Chair, is the noise. And the monitoring of noise is also part of this new Traffic Safety Act. And we had better get our acts together when it comes to what parameters do we want around decibels for noisy mufflers, and where are we going to equip our police with the monitors to check on those? Because this new technology will come. The ability to use this new technology will come, and we won't be ready to implement it by policy or by capital on equipment. So I wouldn't mind Brad's feedback on that. We have talked about this before. And a question for Tasso. I think he mentioned to me one time that he was hoping to hire some permanent staff to do some testing of, just for street calming and all kinds of other things, to monitor speed and turns and all this sort of thing. And right now, I think it's done largely by summer students or temporary students. Does Brad or Tasso, does the new budget include some permanent folks so we can do this more than just during the summer season or the temporary worker season? And just to follow up on somebody else's comments there, I think it was Becky's. I can tell you from West Bedford that right now we're certainly not designing the new roads yet, in anticipation of them being built to be hopefully could have speed at 40 or 45. HRM says the developers aren't asking to do that, and the developer says they're not allowed to because they're waiting for their red book. So there's still some real confusion there, I think, over what they're allowed to build or not. Ideally, right now, newer streets probably should be built career. They should be built less steep and they should be built narrower if we're concerned about speeding. But to my knowledge, that is not yet permitted in our new development. So I wouldn't mind some feedback on that question as well. So technology and being ready for the new act, and then just a little clarification on staff and on new developments. Thanks, Chair.
I can start with the question about the sidewalk list and working with comparing that to traffic calming. So we do communicate with PP&D staff to see, if the street has had a sidewalk requested or if it's coming up for a sidewalk in the future. But it's more of an ad hoc basis as we're receiving requests and moving forward. One of the suggestions for reviewing the policy would be to put more emphasis or consideration on the lack of pedestrian infrastructure and taking a more wholesome look at the street and how it functions.
Good. Yep.
Is there another question?
Yes.
In there?
So Brad or
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor. Yeah. So yeah, councillor, you're absolutely right with respect to the red light cameras. So or enforcement cameras in general. In our budget this year, in our capital budget and our business plan, we have indicated that we want to hire someone to do a study on how we could implement the technology. I believe Brad mentioned it during our TBW budget and business planning presentation that the hardware piece, the on-street hardware piece, is really the easy part. It's the back end piece and the legislative requirements and all of that is the big issue with respect to standing up a red light camera and photo enforcement camera program. So that's why we need some help from experts to kind of guide us as far as which way we go, so we can be ready for the upcoming capital budget in 22-23.
And Tessa, just quickly, I would add to that, the same could be said about the noise regulation too. We're going to need to set policy, and we're going to have to have the equipment to monitor it, right?
Right. Yes, that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I know with Mr. Chair and with police, we met back in the fall to go over the proposed regulations in the Traffic Safety Act. So my colleagues at police reviewed the regulations, and so should there be any equipment required for potential measuring of noise, I would defer back to either our police or bylaw enforcement to undertake that. So a little bit out of my area of expertise. With respect to permanent staff, as I said in the after the presentation, as of last week, we have full-time staff hired to carry out the data collection program.
Oh, good.
So
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so we have 2 full-time staff that are essentially the field folks that are primarily going to spend their time in the field. And we also have someone in the office whose primary job is to take the data and to put it in a database so it's made available for all and to perform some analysis. And he also would have some capability to go on the field and deploy equipment as well for studies.
That's good news. Yeah. Thank you. And as far as new developments, I think you mentioned that we don't want another West Bedford. My worry is we're building more right now because we're still don't have the red book updated, and your hands are kind of tied, and the developers think their hands are tied, and in the middle we have unhappy residents and councils trying to pay for calming.
Well, from the feedback that I've received from most developers are working closely with our planning development folks to make revisions. Internally, Councillor, we do have a variance committee meeting that we bring forward all these different variances from the Red Book on a monthly basis. So I've been seeing a lot through that process as well. Okay.
Well, that's encouraging then. I won't argue with that. So thank you
very much, Councillor. So that leads to my, I'll close out this, and I'll thank staff for their bringing this to us. And I hope you got some of what you were looking for. And if not, Brad or Jody, please ask us if there's anything we missed. As far as the Red Book piece goes and what Councillor Outfit was just talking about, I do. My question is, when do we anticipate that bit of work coming forward? Because we're probably 3 or 4 years into, we'll have that done by the end of next year, and it hasn't been done yet. And I'm not minimizing it or making light of it. I know it's a big piece of work, but making it so the road standards for new construction and for making it clear what we expect a major arterial like St. Margaret's Bay to look like in the future as and when the money is available. I think that's clearly been a priority for council and something we've talked a lot about. Councillor Mancini talked about 2 years of data collection. I know from the local street bikeway and Vernon Street that the data collection from this last year is basically all garbage, and when we can't, there's nothing you can do with it when nobody's like, the patterns have changed, people going to work, different lockdowns and all that stuff. And based on the data we have now, the good people on Henry and Walnut Street who are concerned about shortcutting caused by the local street bikeway, I would tell them that the local street bikeway dropped the amount of traffic on their street. And we know that's not the case. It's that the universities haven't had school, for example, in-person class. I think, though, that there is a real value in iteration. The example I use, and you've all heard me use, is the staff came out and moved the Jersey barricades 6 or 7 times at the corner of Cogswell, Edward, and Roby when that was done, to get to understand how that street really worked and get the geometry right, and what really was a kind of unique situation before it was paved in as a permanent change. And I think that I agree. There's a lot of places where we can get templates, and you see that in other cities where this is what a bump out, a vertical deflection could look like, where it has a drainage channel running along the old curb, so we don't have those issues, and then you put those out. But we're going to continue to iterate, and I think that's important. And I'll just close by saying I really like this approach. It's going to be an awful lot of data collection and crunching, but I think it's really important we stay firmly in an evidence-based approach to where we're going to prioritize, and we don't politicize this and make it a council choice situation or whoever complains the loudest. I certainly think, if we come up with a matrix that we can all live with, and then we run the numbers, there are going to be places that are clearly need it way more than others, and that isn't going to stop our residents from doing what they always do. Everyone I ever talked to about traffic calming says their street is the worst street in the entire universe, and we got to be prepared to defend the matrix when it comes. So I support that coming forward on a neighborhood approach, and I look forward to having that debate, hopefully sooner rather than later. So that'll be my other question, in addition to the Red Book, is when do you think this is going to be able to come back? Because it's, when do we think that we could have a matrix for council to consider and approve for a new administrative order? And then if we do that, how long will it take to gather the data to do the re-ranking?
Yes, so Mr. Chair, so right now the data collection is going to start right now, right? So we're going to collect all the data, so we have this backlog of 200 streets. I'm sure there's more streets that are going to come through the hopper this year. We'll collect all the data and we'll park it. And once the new AO gets approved, then we could spend the time over the fall, winter months to reassess and rejig the priority list. As I said earlier, because of timing, our 2022-23 capital program is going to be based on the current ranked list. There's no real way to go about it. Otherwise, unless council wants to stop the program altogether for 1 year, which I'm pretty sure you don't want to do. So we'll continue. We're hoping to get back to you by the fall at the latest, because the sooner we get it back to you, the quicker that we can start re-ranking the streets. But the reality is it's not going to impact our program for next year, because it's going to be based on the old ranking system.
Thanks for that clarity. And Red Book?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the Red Book. I've been burned a number of times on this question by entering into this fray. I'm not going to handle this question probably. I'm going to get back. We have an IMP. I think the IMP Lunch and Learn that Kelly has set up is for the end of the month. And I'm going to ask her to put on a very robust piece in there about the Red Book. If not, we'll try to issue it in writing, because there's the timing to council, there's the timing in which it gets implemented, and then there's the time frame it takes for developers then to, you start to see that action in the street. And not lost on me, you want it as soon as possible. So, but Kelly's in the best position to really enunciate to council what the impacts look like as a result of those changes and when you can really start to see the change. So I apologize, I'm ill-equipped to handle the question today, but I'll make sure we get in position to get this dealt with. If there's one question I've got repeatedly, that's the one. What I will say though is, you know, don't think, I point to the Cogswell design, the Cogswell District Project design. You have a number of streets in that design that are at their absolute minimum widths or awfully close to it. There are some streets where it's not wide enough for 2 buses to pass at the same time without tucking in mirrors. So that's how, you know, make no doubt about it, the narrow streets are coming. And certainly where streets have been narrowed, we're hearing about it from councillors and from people in the district. So don't lose complete faith. There, certainly the narrowing is occurring here and there. It's not in policy form yet, but certainly is creeping its way into all the designs. It's the developer end of it. I want to make sure that Kelly answers for council. In terms of your question, did we get what we need? Yes, absolutely. Mr. Chair, thank you for the flexibility today. I know this is a bit out of the norm to just come with a presentation and take feedback, but I can assure you that we got a lot of comfort today that we can go forward and start working on the details of this to bring forward to council with a, you know, back to the committee and then hopefully on to council with a high degree of probability of success. So that was what we were hoping to achieve. And I think my team would join me in saying, we got it and we thank you for it. So
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And I do think it's important to any public or potential critics of this discussion that if we change the threshold on speed, it doesn't mean we're changing it forever. We're changing it for now to hit the worst streets first, right? So that doesn't mean we're saying we're never going to do anything on any other street, but that might be past any of our time here on council. So anyway, thank you very much for that, Brad. Thank you, Jody. We'll move on now to 8.2, pedestrian infrastructure, Highway 101, exit 2. I understand we have a short presentation. Is that correct? Dave Hubley, if you'd care to introduce your team, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dave Hubley with Project Planning and Design Services. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
I've been having some audio difficulties, and if they persist, I'll ask Dave McKaysey to jump in for some help. Excuse me. So, Mr. Chair, Council requested that staff review options to improve pedestrian safe passage from the Sackville Manor Mobile Home Park over to Walker Avenue and Old Sackville Road. So we've done that at a high level. To get us started today, we have Siobhan Witherby, who is one of our AT planners in our department, and Phil Nickerson, one of our design engineers. They've done the bulk of the work here, and they are here today to deliver a brief presentation on their findings. After that presentation, Siobhan, Phil, Dave McIsaac, and I will stay on the call to try to answer any questions you or the committee may have. And so with your approval, Mr. Chair, we can have Siobhan and Phil start the presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Please go ahead, Siobhan and Phil.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, Dave. And good afternoon, members of Community Council. I'll reiterate, my name is Siobhan Witherby. I'm an active transportation planner with Transportation and Public Works. And Phil and I are going to give you a brief overview of the report that is in front of you today. That is pedestrian infrastructure considerations for Highway 101 at exit 2. Next slide, please. As we get into this presentation, I'll set up with a bit of context. The area highlighted in red on the map constitutes Sackville Manor Mobile Home Park and Walker Service Road. It's an isolated catchment area of approximately 775 people. And they are isolated from the services in the rest of Sackville by Highway 101, which serves as a large physical barrier. You can see the area in red is quite close to the transit terminal and the Downsview Plaza, but because of that physical barrier, there is no safe way to get there by foot. Next slide, please. So in the map on the right, you can see the routes that they're taking. The dashed route in pink is the shortcut that some members of the community are making to walk along the the gravel shoulders to cut across those highway access ramps as a shortcut to get across to the transit terminal and the Downsview Plaza. It is a shortcut in that it eliminates a lot of the travel time. So if you could run across the highway ramps in 15, 20 minutes and get to your destination versus the alternative, which is the blue dash route, taking people all the way down Walker Service Road to Old Sackville Road and up that way, could take you as much as 45 minutes. So that's not very feasible for all in terms of walking times and distances. So you can see in the image there on the bottom, there's the Beaver Bank connector, which is a 70 km/h posted speed road. There's the gravel shoulder along the side, and then they're cutting up across that exit ramp, which is the exit 2, which is posted at 50 km/h, and sneaking up. There's a little goat path to get to the transit terminal there. So there are posted signs that say no pedestrians, but people are continuing to do this, which is quite unsafe, dashing across higher speed roads. And unfortunately, there's been 2 pedestrian fatalities in the last 10 years, which has been what's brought this to our attention. So we're looking for any sort of safety improvements to potentially formalize this pedestrian crossing. There is a need for this type of facility. Next slide, please. So some of the major considerations that go along with this is that most of the shortcutting is happening across provincial highway access ramps. So this is their jurisdiction. It doesn't belong to HRM. Although HRM's role as a municipality is to build and maintain pedestrian infrastructure, we're able to do that on their property, but we have to have them kind of in agreement, and they'll give us the land to be able to make that connection. Another consideration is property and easement on the other side. So most people right now are accessing the highway from Park Lane Drive, which is just that little street at the top of the mobile home park now. It's not typical to dead end a public facility on private property. We want to make sure that it connects through to the nearest HRM owned road. So we've been in contact with the owners of the mobile home park who aren't keen on creating an easement through the roads in the mobile home park at this time. So the alternative would be to add an extra little piece, that line shown in blue, that takes you down to the nearest HRM owned right of way, which is at the top of Walker Service Road right there, which does add some travel time and cost to this potential proposal. And yeah, the goal is just to make sure that it's not just for the people living in this neighborhood. It could serve all HRM residents should they choose to move through that area. Next slide, please. Another major consideration is that it's not currently included in any of our council approved HRM planning documents. So some of the major ones we refer to are the Active Transportation Priorities Plan and the Integrated Mobility Plan. So by choosing to potentially proceed with this and look at the feasibility and construction of this, it would be kind of going up against some of those other priorities that in major infrastructure projects that are outlined in those plans. So we have to recognize that. The typical process when we're looking at pedestrian infrastructure and trying to prioritize when it's built or if it's built, there is a pedestrian tool called the New Sidewalk Assessment Tool, and it looks at the pedestrian generators. We want to have the maximum impact on residents. So we're looking at areas that are near schools and community centers and senior centers, high density residential areas, areas with employment and commercial destinations, transit, those sort of factors. So we ran this section connecting the Sackville Manor Mobile Home Park to the rest of Sackville through this tool, and it does only rate average for those pedestrian generators. It's a little bit lower density, but it does serve a safety purpose. So we would be, if we proceed with this project, we would be putting kind of a safety and a socioeconomic lens to solve an area where we do have some history of known collisions. Next slide, please. The original ask was for improved pedestrian connectivity, which typically includes a sidewalk, but in this case, we would be recommending that a multi-use pathway is considered. It's only marginally wider than a sidewalk and doesn't have too much added cost, but it allows the added users of people on bicycles or people walking, rolling, skating, scooting, anyone to be able to travel across it. It has kind of the transportation purposes as well as recreational. There are some greenways moving through that Sackville area. So if it were to connect into the Sackville Greenway system, that is the facility type that it would connect to. We know that there is going to be some sort of structure required to cross over under the highway, and that accessibility is a major concern. And with that, I will hand off to Phil to take you through some of the options that we looked into. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Siobhan. We've met with the province and had discussions with the province about what could happen here, and had a few key takeaways. One of the key takeaways is that any crossings of the highway or highway ramps would have to be grade separated. So you can see the image on the top shows an example of a grade separated crossing for a pedestrian crossing. So we'd be looking at something similar or to this, or at least the same idea. Also, for sections where we're moving pedestrians adjacent to the highway, we'd want some kind of a barrier, like a Jersey barrier or a guardrail for safety. As well, looked at what we could do to use the existing exit 2 overpass shown on the bottom, and took some measurements and kind of drew up an initial cross section. It looks like there is room to fit something in there, kind of based on high level conversations with the province, subject to further study and further review. But it does look promising, like we could use that space to route our pathway underneath there. There's no plans, the province has no plans to replace or upgrade that structure, so we'd be working with what's there now. Next slide, please. So here's a high-level look at the 3 options that we've identified and have done a brief comparison. All 3 of them connect to the Walker Service Road on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And options 1 and 2 go underneath the highway, the existing overpass that I talked about on the previous slide. I'll talk about the details of these a bit more in the next slide. Option 3 in the green utilizes some HRM parkland to connect to the other side of the highway. Next slide, please. Option 1 shown here is the longest and most expensive route. It passes below the highway through the exit 2 overpass. It has the shortest pedestrian bridge, kind of shown there in the red, but also requires this a longer section of new trail development, which would likely be more expensive, which probably includes retaining walls and some storm drainage infrastructure. This is convenient because it connects to the end of Park Lane Drive, where most of the, which follows the connection point for most of the pedestrians that are using the highway now. However, there's no direct connection to the transit terminal. Next slide, please. Option 2 shown here follows this very similar route to option 1, except it has a longer structure which passes over 2 legs of the roadway and connects directly to the transit terminal. It also has, similar to option 1, an extension, approximately 800-meter long extension that connects to Walker Service Road, just to maintain that public access on both sides. Next slide, please. And option 3 shown here goes through HRM Parkland to access Walker Avenue. The parkland is substantially lower than the highway, 6 meters or so. So there would have to be some switchbacks installed to build up from that grade to get to the highway, and then additional ramps for this bridge structure itself to go over top of the highway with enough clearance. So there's a lot of grade challenges on this one. It may require some property acquisition to connect directly into the park. Otherwise, it's the connection will be less convenient. It's the shortest route and may not also follow the desire line for pedestrians who are using the bottom side of Park Lane Drive as their most convenient access point, as shown on options 1 and 2. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, to compare these 3 options, we can say that option 1 is not recommended because it doesn't provide that direct connection to the Sackville Transit Terminal, and people who are looking to access the terminal may continue to shortcut across the road as they do now, which would be not safe without a crossing there. HRM, based on our current level of review, we recommend the direct connection option 2, which provides that direct connection to the transit terminal. The province has indicated that they're in favor of option 3, which is shown in green and crosses the highway. And the reason is because there's it doesn't place the path directly adjacent to the highway as the other options do. These 2 options could be compared further during functional planning. A couple things that we've considered on a high level, but would also be subject to further review or study, would be things such as grades and slopes, as I mentioned, switchbacks for option 3, drainage considerations, lighting, and of course the province would have to approve any design, any facility, because it would be on their land, and any easements or agreements that would have to be put in place as a result of that. We've looked at very high-level financial implications to carry this forward to functional planning, community consultation, et cetera. It would be somewhere in the range of 50 to 100,000, and the overall construction costs, very high level, would be 3 to 4.5 million, depending on which route is chosen. And these costs could be refined further based on future study and more detailed design. Next slide, please. And I'll pass over the recommendation for Siobhan to summarize.
Thank you, Phil. So we've done a good amount of work to see whether or not building a pedestrian connection through this area was even feasible for us to consider moving forward with. And our recommendation is that Transportation Standing Committee recommend to Regional Council that we proceed with a full functional planning study in the budget year 2022-2023, pending their budget approval, which will allow us to get a better idea of the true project costs and some of the challenges associated with it. It'll help us narrow in on the preferred route that is the most feasible, and also that the community thinks that they would use. So the public engagement would be a large component of that we haven't yet sought out. But yeah, that would allow us to having more information about it would allow us to better prioritize it against other projects that are also being built, and we can fit it into sort of our construction plans moving forward. The second part of the recommendation is for HRM staff to initiate conversation with the province to request that they install measures, for example, jersey barriers or additional fencing in the meantime, to serve as a deterrent to pedestrian crossing between Sackville Manor and Old Sackville Road, where we do have this established safety issue. And that would be kind of in the meantime while we try and sort a safer pedestrian crossing out. Next slide, please. The alternative is that Transportation Standing Committee could recommend to Regional Council that we do not pursue functional planning of this connection, and instead focus our efforts on building out the already council-approved routes within the IMP and the AT plan as higher priority projects. This involves the risk of future pedestrian collisions in the absence of a formalized crossing. Next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much. We're available for any questions you may have.
Thank you both so much for that. I think that before we go to, before I ask you to put the motion on the floor, Councillor Russell, could you make a motion to extend the meeting to 3:30?
Absolutely. I'd like to move that the Transportation Standing Committee meeting is extended beyond 3 o'clock.
Second, Tim.
I like that wording better. Moved by Councillor Russell, second by Councillor Deputy Mayor Outset. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll move to vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Carries. All right, Councillor Russell.
Thank you very much. I would like to move that the Transportation Standing Committee recommend that Halifax Regional Council 1 direct staff to conduct functional planning in 2021-22-23 pursuant to funding approval in 2022-23 capital budget to establish the feasibility of a formal pedestrian crossing from Sackville Manor across Highway 101 based on the considerations outlined in the discussions section of the staff report dated March 22nd, 2021. And 2, direct staff to initiate conversation with Nova Scotia Transportation Infrastructure and Renewal to request that they install measures, for example, Jersey barriers or fencing, to serve as a deterrent to pedestrian crossing between Sackville Manor and Old Sackville Road as an interim measure. And I so move.
Second, Tim.
Moved by Councillor Russell, seconded by Deputy Mayor Outset. Go ahead, Councillor Russell.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely thrilled to see this come before us. This has been a long-standing problem, and we have had the couple of deaths that have been mentioned before. Whenever you're trying to cross a highway off-ramp or on-ramp, when it's unlit, when it's remote, when cars are accelerating or decelerating, and they're traveling at near highway speeds, it's not a good situation. And yet that's what we're faced with. And this is a situation where people have been doing this for decades. And fortunately, we have only had 2 fatalities. And they are continuing to do it today. I was on site today at the Sackville bus terminal having a conversation, and there was a young man who crossed the road right then. They are doing it all the time. So this is absolutely needed to make this section of this crossing a little bit safer. I'd like to speak to some of the specifics about it. I did take some of the concepts and go through the Sackville Manor Trailer Park, speaking with as many residents as I could, and I did this in the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020. And it's not the overwhelming majority, it is 100% of people favored option 2. The option where people would continue along the same road that they're using and then go up effectively 2 stories and directly over to the Sackville bus terminal. So we can redo the community consultation. They are prepared for it, and they have chosen 100% to do that. Now, I recognize that the province prefers the option where it crosses the highway with a bridge. There would be some acquisition of land with that, and that would be suboptimal. I presented that as an option to the community as well, and they said they would not use that. They would continue to walk around the route that they are currently doing, recognizing the degree of difficulty. I appreciate also that it is accessible. This was one of the strong considerations. Because we don't just have able-bodied people, we have young mothers with, or young parents, I guess, with strollers. At this point, it is not an accessible route to be able to go up the hill. And when you have a look at attachment B in the report, the very first page there in attachment B with the photos taken on January 21st, 2019, shows the route that they would take, and that's not possible if you are if you have challenges walking or if you're in a wheelchair. And the options that we're talking about, the 3 of them, all allow for accessible transportation. So I'm absolutely thrilled with this. The one concern I have with the motion is what it would look like with the province installing measures to serve as a deterrent. At this point, the way the route starts is people go down to the end of the Sackville Manor Trailer Park where there's a fire gate. It takes a long time for fire services to get to Sackville Manor Trailer Park. So they come up the exit, open a fire gate, drive the fire engine through, and they're right there. The alternative is for them to take the same 1.5 or 2 kilometer route that everybody else would take. So that fire gate has to stay. What happens beyond that is if the province installs fencing to say, no, don't use the shoulder of the road, it would push them further into traffic. And my fear is that it would, no matter the circumstance, it would make it more dangerous. Trying to prevent people from using it they would still use it. I am absolutely convinced of that, and it would make the situation more dangerous. But I look forward to this discussion on that. I am happy to, along with Siobhan and Phil, thank you very much, Siobhan and Phil, for the amount of work that you have put into this, for meeting with me last year to go over some of the concepts related to it, and for being as thorough as you have been. Along with Siobhan and Phil, I would be happy to answer any questions from the community's perspective. The community is looking to get from the trailer park predominantly to the bus terminal to get to work, or go a little bit further and get to Downstream Mall. And this is option 2 is an ideal solution for that to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Russell. Were there any questions in there? I think that was all just, thank yous, was it not? So we'll go to Councillor Mancini.
It was.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. First of all, 2 fatalities is too many. And that needs to be clear. I think everyone agrees with that one for sure. It's interesting. I'm surprised at option 3, because you're talking about property acquisition. I mean, you're talking about residential properties, and I think there are times when that has to be done. This is definitely not one of them. That's for darn sure. So glad to. I think we all agree on that one. I guess my question is around the cost. So you're talking about $3 million to $4.5 million. I understand that the province doesn't do pedestrian type of activities anymore, even though they do still own some pedways in Dartmouth. So has there been any conversation about cost sharing on this project when it comes to the province?
I can jump in to answer that question. Through you, Mr. Councillor, to the chair. We have been in contact with the province to talk about potential routing and potential cost sharing and whose jurisdiction it is to build and maintain the infrastructure. In those conversations, the understanding was that HRM would be funding it fully and paying to maintain it fully. I guess it could be breached in the functional planning as we get a little bit closer and the costs get a little bit more clear. We build the community support for it, but right now the understanding is that HRM would be paying for it fully.
Yeah, and not too surprising that's the answer. I don't accept that answer. I mean, they're trying to be so kind and give us the 2 pedways in Dartmouth free of charge, and it needs about $10 million in upgrades. Yeah, thanks, province. I know we have 2 very active MLAs in that area. I'm hoping I assume they've been engaged on this, and maybe we should make that part of the motion. And look at the Councillor Russell in the part 2 of the motion to include a formal conversation about cost sharing, because this is their community too. And I don't buy the fact they don't do pedestrians. And we had 2 deaths on it. And so I'll leave it up to you, Councillor Russell, if you want to add that to it. But I think we should be quite clear that there's some sort of cost sharing. They ask us all the time about cost sharing on their projects. We've got this lovely art gallery. They're going to ask us for a whole bunch of money to cost share. So why not us ask the other way around? I think we should be asking for cost sharing on this. My 2 cents worth. I'll wait to hear from my colleagues with their thoughts on it. The functional plan. So the functional plan, if I clear, when it comes back, if this is approved today, the staff, you are going to come back with your recommended option out of the 3. Is that correct? They won't be coming back for 3 options I know, Councilor Russell, what's your favorite option, but when staff come back, you're going to come back and say, yeah, here's the work, here's how much it cost, and we recommend a option, whatever of the three options, or if there's another option. Is that correct?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. That is our intention. We would choose one option, and we would have 30% designs and a better idea of costing of exactly that option that we would wish to pursue.
Okay, I support this, Councilor Russell. I support this. I do really hope that you add to the part 2 of that motion, the province coughing up their share of it, because they should, by all means. It's their community too. Thank you. See, Mr. Hubel wants to speak.
Noted, Councillor Kent. Mr. Hubel, you want to throw something in
Yeah,
there?
Mr. Chair, just I mean, we can certainly reach out to the province again and ask them more formally, but just in my experience, we've broached this topic with the province numerous times over the years, and they've been quite steadfast in the response that they don't cost share with projects similar to this type of construction.
Yeah, you know what? I understand that, but it's truly unacceptable. It really is, and we need to continue to ask. There's a new sheriff in town with the province, a new minister, and part of it also. And you know what? I tell you right now, when it comes to that conversation at council, regional council, with regard to cost sharing about the art gallery, I'll be bringing it up at that point in time. That's great, but they should be coughing up their share, Dave. And I know that's the answer you've always gotten, but we need to continue asking, my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you, and because that was my point, Deputy Mayor, I'm going to go now, and I'll go to you after. On the cost sharing piece, it'll be a lot easier for us to accept paying for this 100% if the province comes through on the Friendship Center, on the turret renovation of the Khyber, and the $720 million bus rapid transit electrification ferry plan, right? Like at that point, I would have no hesitation. But right now, the problem is that we're not seeing those things. Now, I think these things are coming. I'm actually more excited and bullish than I've ever been in the past. So I'm actually going to push back and say, I don't think we need to make it conditional because we don't have the final funding decision today. We don't need to make an amendment right now, in my opinion, if I may speak from the chair to that, because I expect we will see things change rapidly over the next couple of months with the Premier Rankin and the new government in there. So I'm hopeful. What I originally just plugged in to say is I grew up right behind, my parents owned houses in Creighton Park, and we kept moving away and coming back as Navy people do. And the last place I lived was right behind Penhorn Mall. And I just got to say, I share Councillor Russell's hesitancy about putting in fences or obstacles, because there's nothing people wanted to do more in Dartmouth on a Saturday night than tear that fence down on the circumferential if it was between them and the Kmart Mall or whatever. And so, until you build the overpass, at that point, you still, I think, would need to put in a fence, definitely, to help drive that behavior. But, I hesitate to do anything to make it harder, because I think it would make it more dangerous at this point, as ludicrous as that is, because it's so dangerous. The fact that anybody's doing it is a bit horrifying. But so that second part there, I don't know what to do about that, whether there's going to be an amendment or discussion or further direction from the councillor. But that does, I have concerns about that. I think that it could make it manifestly a lot harder to keep people safe.
Just a point of clarification. That may have been the case in Dartmouth before, Councillor, Mr. Chair, but now we're a much more relaxed group in Dartmouth. We're not.
Well, that's because they built 3 pedestrian overpasses on the circumferential, Tony. But we can talk about that later. We'll go to Councillor Outhead.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I agree with the comments from both of you. When we had the high school built in Bedford, HRM had to pay to put the sidewalk under the 102 ramp and for kids to walk to the school, et cetera, et cetera. However, they did add a lane down the road, and they have given us some COVID money. And as you said, Mr. Chair, that hopefully we're going to give us some money to do things like Fair East and VRT and whatnot. So we'll have to pick and choose our battles. But there certainly has been my experience as well, even though it was under their road and leading to the school that they located, that HRM was responsible for the walking infrastructure, if you will, on Hem's Plains Road and under the 102. So unfortunately, we may be fighting a losing battle on that one, but hopefully we'll get money and from other projects that will offset that. So anyway, just a little history there on what I went through with on Hem's Plains Road.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. We'll go to Councillor Russell to close.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, Tim. You're good? Okay.
Sorry, you said something and you were muted. I just couldn't hear what you said.
No, we'll go to Councillor Russell to close.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to continue where I left off. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the councillors for showing your support and showing your recognition of the challenges with that second piece. 2 points I would like to speak to. I'm going to start with the option, not the option 2, but the second point first, and that is I would like to make an amendment, and that is to change the word install measures to consider measures, so that we aren't directing them to actually install the measures. It will make things more difficult. I think it makes sense for us to...
By Councillor Russell, seconded by... Well, actually, who is seconder on the motion? Clerk, I forget. Tim?
I seconded it, and that's fine. Yep.
Okay, we'll consider that friendly. If there's,
Yep,
if there's
friendly.
no one against, agreed. That's friendly amendment.
Thank you. The second point is around cost sharing. MLA Craig and I met with then Minister Hines of Transportation Infrastructure and Renewal and talked about this and talked about the options. And it was clear at that point as well that cost sharing would not be something that they would easily consider. I like Councillor Mason's suggestions that if there was money on the table to service other projects, it would be a heck of a lot easier for us to be able to move forward on this one. What I would not like is for the funding to be a condition of moving ahead with this. If the provincial funding, so that if we don't get the provincial funding, we don't move ahead with this. I think that puts us in the wrong place. So I do appreciate the consideration of that. I was also asked earlier today, what would be the worst case scenario? And I'm not one who you should really ask that question to. Worst case scenario, in my mind, is that we choose one of the options that the residents don't choose. So we choose one of the options that they say that they won't use. In that case, we would be left with two situations. One of them is we would spend a pile of money investigating this and potentially building something, and they would still use the same route where they are crossing the traffic and it is unprotected. So we would continue to see the collisions mount. And I think in this case, we can call them accidents. I don't think they are collisions in the same sense that we have considered that before. These are people who are where they shouldn't be, but they are still doing it. And we need to make this safer. So I appreciate everybody's support for this, staff and councillors alike. And thank you for coming forward with such thoroughly investigated options for us to discuss and review.
With Councillor Russell, there's no one further on the list. The motion we are voting on as amended is posted in the chat. So question's been called. We'll move to a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Good work, everyone. Thank you, staff.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on now to 9, notice of table matters none. 10, correspondence, petitions, delegations. 10.1, correspondence. Madam Clerk, could you please give us the correspondence?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there were a couple pieces of general correspondence received and circulated to the standing committee.
Thank you very much. 10.2, petitions. Clerk, do you have any petitions?
Mr. Chair, there are no petitions from the clerk's office.
Do any members of council have any petitions? No petitions from the committee. 10.3, there are no presentations. 11, no information items brought forward, no staff reports, no committee reports, no motions, no in camera, no added items. Does anyone have a notice of motion? Seeing none, date of the next meeting is April 22nd, 2021. We get to do it all again. just
Actually,
a
my
week.
apology, Mr. Chair, that's an error.
2029.
It's April 29th, not April
29.
22nd. Yeah.
We're on the 29th, which is still very, very near. So we get to do this all again shortly. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Hello.
So moved.
I think Councillor Mancini